Welcome to the Next Level Human podcast. As a human, you have a job to do. In fact, you have 4 jobs: to earn and manage money, to attain and maintain health and fitness, to build and sustain personal relationships, to find meaning and make a difference. None of these jobs are taught in school, and that is what this podcast is designed to do: to educate us all on living our most fulfilled lives through the mastery of these 4 jobs. I'm your host, Dr. Jade Teta, and I believe we are here living this life for 3 reasons and 3 reasons only: to learn, to teach, and to love. In this podcast, I will be learning, teaching, and loving right along with you. I'm grateful to have your company. Here's to our next level.
All right, hey guys, we're here with Dr. Jade. So Dr. Jade, thanks for joining me this morning. Happy to have you on. Dr. Jade's an expert on all things human performance and just kind of optimal living and things. And so we're excited to kind of open up some discussions about it. But first, I thought maybe if you could tell everybody out there a little bit about yourself, your passions, and you put out a lot of great content, a lot of free stuff. And so just kind of what inspired you to do that and bring you to where you are today?
Yeah, well, I think probably why we have sort of good alignment is because I come from a background of personal training. I believe it or not, I started doing that when I was 15 years old. So I actually started earning money at 15 years old to write programs for people on my football team and their family members. Okay. And that kind of went into a love of, obviously fitness and then nutrition for performance. That basically took me to undergrad in biochemistry. And then I kind of reached a crossroad there because I was looking at traditional medical school. Of course, I had already been doing lifestyle medicine all through undergrad and even in high school. And I was kind of shocked at that time to see that, most MDs, at least at the time, the curriculums I was looking at UNC Chapel Hill and UNC Greenville, those curriculums were no exercise, no nutrition, and very little psychology, which was all of my interest, coaching and counseling and writing fitness programs and doing nutrition. And so I decided to go to the naturopathic route. And at the time, being a science-based guy, it was a big leap of faith. I had no idea that functional medicine, integrative medicine was going to become, sort of a mainstream thing. At the time, I just wanted to do lifestyle medicine. And that's why I went in that direction. And it kind of turned out nicely for me. But after I graduated from that program, I basically wrote a book back in 2010 that was a best-selling book called The Metabolic Effect Diet that launched me into the internet space. And now you can kind of think of me as sort of a personal trainer mixed with a nutritionist, mixed with a natural medicine physician, and a strong bit of psychology and philosophy on top of that. And so I like to say I specialize in mind, muscle, and metabolism. And funnily enough, a part of what my clinical work was a lot of female related metabolism. And so I kind of got into the specialty of endocrinology and hormones. And obviously that's why I love you all and kind of is the synergy there. So that gives you a broad spectrum of sort of my base. And I would say functional medicine is what I do. Functional endocrinology is mostly what I do. And I write books and educate, other healthcare providers in physical change using metabolism and also personal development as well. So that's my area of expertise and what I love to do.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I just noticed looking through your site, there's a lot in some of your content. There's just a lot of different angles that you tackle that. Obviously, it's a very complex topic for people trying to lose weight. I think a lot of people out there too, they beat themselves up because they think it's as easy as, I'm going to just eat a little less. And then when they struggle with that, maybe they're beating themselves up, where I'm going to, just get after and exercise more. And they, maybe don't adjust certain things. And then they're kind of not seeing the results they thought they would, or their friend is seeing, and things of that nature. Because I found it interesting. So I think my point in bringing that up is just, looking at a lot of your content, what you're doing, as well as, some of the testing that we do. I think it just gives people hope, they can see. And and I'll kind of touch on this in a minute a little bit more, but there was I was looking at the flexible metabolism podcast you did recently.
Yeah.
And I think it's just so helpful for people to know, oh, there's more to this, and I'm not a failure, and there is some hope, there's some light at the end of the tunnel, because people have different metabolic conditions or little things going on in the background that they just don't understand. And will they have someone like yourself educating them on maybe some questions to check in on and process, or through our partnership and things, getting some more thorough testing and diagnostics to say, ooh, that's a roadblock in my pathways here to do that. So
yeah.
I would like to kind of ground on that, if we could maybe start there. If you could talk briefly, I know you did this in your podcast, but just on the study I found very interesting with the women who were exercising and didn't lose weight, and just kind of give the group, the audience out there, just a little brief overview of what that was, and kind of what your angle was on that in your talk.
Yeah, it's perfect. And let's do a little background, if you don't mind, Joe, just
Sure.
really quickly into that particular study. One of the things that I think we have to realize when we talk about, I guess we'll just focus on weight loss in general, but obviously metabolism is in charge of that. And the idea is that we are working from a model, the industry as a whole is working from a model that is incomplete at best and perhaps at worst wrong. Mm-hmm. And so let's just give it the benefit of the doubt and say it's incomplete. And so what essentially that means is we've all heard this idea that eat less, exercise more, or create these energy deficits is required for weight loss. Now, more specifically, we want fat loss. We want to maintain our muscle, which we'll get into a little bit with some of the hormones and why those can be powerful there. And I would say that is absolutely true, right? This idea that we absolutely need a calorie deficit and that calorie discrepancy if we're going to lose weight. However, we need something else. Not only do we need a calorie deficit, we need a sustained calorie deficit. So what that essentially means is, well, what helps us sustain the calorie deficit? Well, the hormonal communication network in the body is what is controlling and informing things like hunger and energy and cravings and sleep and mood and motivation and focus and exercise performance and exercise recovery and all of these things. So you can certainly create a calorie deficit, but if that changes hormones in a way that causes hunger to go up, energy to become unstable and unpredictable, and cravings to become out of control, then that calorie deficit is not going to be sustained. And so what the whole world is doing is saying, oh, I'll create a calorie deficit, and inadvertently in that process, creating a hormonal situation that causes the metabolism to push back, to compensate. So to me, this would be law one of metabolism, a new law that we all need to be aware of, which essentially says the metabolism is not a calculator or chemistry set. It's more like a stress barometer and thermostat. In other words, it is adaptive and reactive. So you create a calorie deficit and it goes, wait a second, I don't like this. This is a stress to the system, and it changes all its hormonal software to create hunger and cravings. And then you reverse what you just did. And we all know what this is like. And so the first step here is to understand we need a calorie deficit. We need a sustained calorie deficit. And that's about hormones. Now, this particular study is one of the first studies that kind of blew my mind as an exercise guy that was like, wait a second, something is happening here. And so if you followed what I just said there, you'll understand this study, and we can break it down a little bit. But this study is known as the alpha and beta trials that were done with Canadian women, mainly in the perimenopausal range. These are women, basically 40 to 55 in general. And they basically said, look, we don't want you to do anything consciously to change your diet. What we want you to do is we're going to have you do either 30, 45, or 60 minutes of essentially treadmill jogging 5 days per week. So there were 3 groups. One group did 30 minutes of treadmill jogging 5 days per week. The other did 45, and the third group did 60. So that is a lot of energy being burned. And if you're not consciously changing your diet and doing what you were doing previously, then we should see, if the metabolism works like a calculator, we should see weight loss. And indeed we did. In about 10% of those women, they lost actually more weight than was predicted. But 25% of those women lost some weight. Most of them did not lose as much weight as would be predicted. So that's great. But then you might say, well, what happened to the other 75% of these women? Well, 50% saw no change in weight at all. And shockingly, 25% actually gained weight as a result of this. Now, in the old model, we would essentially say, well, that can't happen because they created this calorie deficit. So what then happened? Well, obviously, they weren't able to consciously control their diet. So they compensated with increased food intake enough to wipe out the calorie deficit created by the calorie deficit created by exercise. And in some cases, to completely not only wipe it out, but actually go into calorie excess. So as a result of this exercise, 75% of the women either did not lose weight or actually gained weight, and only 25% saw weight loss, most of those not as much as predicted. And of course, there were some that saw more than predicted. So this tells us a couple things about metabolism. One, the law of compensation. Whatever you do to push on the metabolism, it oftentimes is going to push back. If you try to speed metabolism through exercise, through fat burners, through hormones, actually, another way to do it. If you try to use cold therapies or anything like that, you're usually inadvertently also speeding hunger and cravings in the vast majority of people. So rule number one for metabolism says the metabolism is more like a thermostat. It's adaptive and reactive. This study also told us about rule number two, that we are each individual. And so there's going to be individual reactions. Not everyone responds the same way to diet and exercise. And so if you understand that, then it starts to change the equation for us as practitioners. It essentially says, how do I begin to understand how people are compensating? And how do I switch my model to go from speeding metabolism to creating a more flexible metabolism? And what I would say, what most hormones do, if you get it right, they're not actually speeding metabolism. They're making the metabolism more flexible, more adaptable. And this is why they can be so powerful, but only in the context of doing all the other lifestyle things. Like we all know, we can't just give patients hormones and see them magically turn around. However, we can give people hormones, have them do some of the other things lifestyle wise, and see those things have a better response as a result. For example, we know if we have someone who's hypothyroid and we try to put them on a diet, they're mostly going to compensate. It's going to be very difficult for them to get the results. However, if we put them on hormone replacement therapy and create a narrow gap in calories rather than this wide gap, and make sure we have a balance between energy output and recovery, we can do amazing things with the use of that hormone. Same goes for testosterone replacement therapy. Same goes for bioidentical HRT. We can use these approaches in a way that can make a big difference, but only in my mind, if we are looking at the new science of metabolism and understanding what we're dealing with. We're going to have to do both the calorie deficit and the hormonal balance. And that is how we begin to make a difference, which is why working with your company is so exciting to someone like myself, because I do mostly now education. And so from my perspective, I have all these people saying, hey, Jade, can I work with you as an individual clinician now? And I'm like, well, I'm mostly educating other physicians now in what I do. Sure. And so I need to send them to a place where they can actually get these therapies and be able to avail themselves of this new way of looking at things. Now, of course, as you and I know, it's still not easy, but it's much better than the old model. And so hopefully that helps sort of open up discussion about what we're missing with metabolism and why you can never look at a calorie deficit in isolation without you looking at the communication network of the body, which is hormonal therapies. And these two together can begin creating better outcomes. Now, there's still a lot we do not know, and we just have to be clear about that. And most people in science understand it's an emerging sort of topic. But this is far better than the old model, which just says, hey, exercise more and eat less.
No, I appreciate you walking through that. And I think a part of why it really grabbed me was I've seen it firsthand with family members and friends and people I've helped or people our clinic has helped, to where, especially myself personally, like living in Michigan, it goes from cold weather to hot weather. And I've seen, as soon as the season starts to change, some people will drop 5, 10, 15 pounds. Others remain the same. And they're going, what is going on? And I think a lot of it is that signaling, as you're talking about, when that changes to where energy expenditures go up, you start doing yard work, you're outside more, you're more active, and then you start snacking more, overeating, and those things will signaling. And if you look back at the other studies that also talk about reporting, you mentioned like conscious and unconscious, right? They're unconsciously doing this. And it's not that people are malicious or failures or whatever the case is, that they're, people just beat themselves up so much over this. It's just having an understanding of this is what's going to happen in your body first and foremost. And then, how to counteract that. So I just really found that, especially this time of year, I'm sitting here in mid-June and it's going to be like high 90s for the first time here in Michigan today. So that really spoke to me as I was going through your content recently. Was like, definitely want to unpack that with you today. So I appreciate you walking through that, because it's just, I think it's really, really eye-opening for people and can help shine a lot of hope as far as, hey, this is a process, and some people are going to, hit a little bit earlier in that process, and others you got to work through a little bit, but stay in the fight and you're going to be okay. So
and you want to know, I'll just mention something there as well, Joe. It's like a lot of people don't understand either that when you look at the calorie model, right, it is an incomplete model in itself anyway. Research actually tells us 20% of food labels and 20% of what we believe we know about how many calories are in foods is skewed, either too high or too low. And the research shows pretty conclusively now that we humans are dramatically underestimating what we eat by as much as 30%. So that is basically one meal a day we are essentially missing over time. Now, we can certainly track that day 1, day 2, day 3, but over 2 weeks, 3 weeks, if researchers follow people around, they realize that they misremember what they eat to such a degree that eventually they cannot account for 30% of their calories on average. Now, of course, this is individual. Some people are going to overestimate it even or underestimate it even more than others. Some may be just, right around, but this is what is happening here. So again, it does illustrate this sort of downfall of the calorie model. Now, it doesn't mean it's wrong. I certainly don't think it is wrong. It is just now we're getting into the practical application of it in terms of weighing and measuring, and in terms of tracking of foods based on the individual psychology. That's why I say if we're going to work with patients, we got to look at their physiology, which we do, but we also have to look at their psychology and then their personal preferences and their practical circumstances. These 4 things are what make up the individual. And if we want to talk about evidence-based medicine, one of the interesting things about that is that it's become such a buzzword now, and most people take it to mean just research. But what evidence-based medicine really means is, what does the body of research say? What is the physiology, psychology, personal preferences, and circumstances of the person in front of me? And then what's my clinical experience as a clinician? That is evidence-based medicine, the research body, the individual sitting in front of us, and the experience of the clinician. And so once again, we really have to, if we really look at this closely, we'll see a lot of what we're missing. We can't just do input A and expect to get out, input B. We have to realize that when we're dealing with a person, there is a big web that we have to begin to uncover. Now, of course, the reason I deal with hormones on a regular basis, and I'm always talking about hormones, is because the metabolism doesn't speak English. It speaks metabolism. And it is a communications hub, basically. And it is using these signaling molecules, hormones, myokines, incretins, all these things to communicate this. And especially when we look at things like testosterone replacement therapy or estrogen and progesterone, they are informing and communicating with and balancing out this communication symphony, and can make a big difference in lifestyle, adherence for individuals, which is why I think it's so critical. And we have to be looking at this. But again, I think we can't make the other mistake where we're simply saying, okay, now we're going to go all hormones, right? It's both. It's not quantity over quality. It's not quality over quantity. It's both. It's not calories over hormones or hormones over calories. It's both. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where you and I, especially, and your company is, in complete alignment. And I think that is important that most clinicians start to understand that, because the tool is only as good as the framework in which it informs, in my opinion, right? Mm-hmm. So we have to essentially be able to understand how to use these tools in a way that does make a difference.
Right. Yeah. Just, you're talking a little bit, getting into kind of hormones a little bit and talking about, testing and things. First, I'd just like to get your input on blood work, what you generally see that's recommended, age appropriate, have it be male, female. Certainly have a lot of different panels, but if we can maybe unpack a little bit of that, just what you're seeing as a clinician and what you're putting out there as education, as far as, what are some of the key things that you look for or recommend people look for in blood work. And then we kind of unpack that a little bit further.
Yeah, well, I'll kind of break down at least my model the way I see it. If you can visualize a pyramid, to me, if we're looking at body comp, which I'm filtering just to remind everyone, I'm kind of filtering this discussion through body composition changes and weight loss. We can certainly go in other directions here, but from that perspective, I look at the hormonal pyramid in a sense, the way I look at it. And I say calories are at the base of that pyramid. Okay. That doesn't necessarily mean, again, the whole pyramid. If you don't have the pyramid, you don't have the structure. So I'm not saying calories are the end all be all, but you can't overcome, calorie excesses and expect to lose weight. So I put that first. Now you can't separate that from a lot of the hormones either. But if we're looking at laboratory testing, I go, okay, so calories come first. Now, what are the hormones that I would most want to look at to give me an indication of metabolic flexibility? We know that insulin resistance, for example, creates a metabolically rigid state. We know this because no matter what you do, you'll see the body cannot use blood sugars and blood fats, and they both rise. So you got triglycerides high and you got blood sugar high. So I look at those to assess insulin. And the other one, I would say, the stress hormone, is cortisol. And both of them are influencing this because insulin has a negative impact on cortisol in terms of cortisol also makes the body. The first thing I'm looking at is any laboratory measures that can tell me about insulin and cortisol, either directly or indirectly. So that's going to be triglycerides. That's going to be fasting blood sugar. That's going to be fasting insulin. It's also going to be looking at, AST and ALT and some of the liver markers that basically tell us, are we dealing with non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, or what are we dealing with here? So to me, I'm looking at those things first. So as clinicians, I would say we have a lot of tests that help us infer this directly. Another one that I think is right there above calories, if I said insulin, cortisol, I think vitamin D, because it does so much, is another one that I'm looking at that I would be putting on top of a chem panel plus a CBC. So I would be looking at those. To me, next up is going to be things like looking at all the other downstream things related to the hypothalamus pituitary axes. So I'm interested in the HPA, the HPT thyroid, and the HBG gonadal. So that to me is next. So now I'm looking at thyroid related dysfunction. And to me, in that regard, TSH is not, in my mind, all we want to be looking at, because obviously what we now know with tissue level hypothyroidism, you can be hypothyroid at the level of tissues and not see that showing up in the blood. So to me, a full thyroid panel becomes next in line. So we got chem panel, we got CBC, we got vitamin D. And then for me, I'm looking at, okay, I want to know what's going on with the thyroid. So for me, that's TSH, free T3, free T4, reverse T3, which I know is very controversial, but you can't tell anything about tissue level hypothyroid without getting that marker. Right. And then sometimes, obviously, if you start seeing that there's an issue there, you may want to go and look and see what's going on. Is there Hashimoto's involved? So maybe you're getting TPO and TBG antibodies. Finally, from there, then I go into testosterone, high sensitivity estrogen if you're a male, and then estrogen progesterone if you're a female, and maybe SHBG, which, by the way, SHBG also can tell us about tissue level hypothyroidism, since estrogen and these things thyroid can impact SHBG. So can estrogen and testosterone. So that is kind of where I start. I go calories, then I go, what are the next three most important communication hormones in my mind? Now, all of us are professionals, so we could argue about this, but in my mind, I go insulin, cortisol, vitamin D next. Then I go thyroid. Then I go testosterone and estrogen and progesterone. And of course, there's some ancillary markers around that. Sure. Like I said, SHBG, fasting, insulin, et cetera. So that's kind of where I start. I'd be interested to see how you evaluate that and what you think I'm missing. But that is essentially how I break this down first when I'm looking at what hormones do I want to measure. And by the way, what's really interesting about this, if you look at especially insulin and cortisol, you can tell an awful lot about those two hormones simply by the biofeedback, the language the metabolism is speaking. This is why I oftentimes talk about a funny little acronym I use called SHMEC: sleep, hunger, mood, energy, and cravings, especially hunger, energy, and cravings. Insulin and cortisol, those two hormones are dramatically impacting hunger, energy, and cravings. We oftentimes forget insulin is a hunger hormone, both perhaps in and of itself and also the impact it has on leptin. We also know that cortisol basically increases the motivation or decreases the motivation centers in the brain, amplifies the reward centers in the brain. We know stressed out rats tend to eat more highly palatable foods, tend to eat less often, bigger meals. Same thing happens in humans. But when you start seeing this SHMEC, sleep, hunger, mood, energy, and cravings go out of check, this is a good indication that this hormonal software system is perhaps not doing well. The metabolism's under stress. And it would, even if they're not running those tests, I would say, okay, right away, you're going to see those issues sort of pop up. Right. So then I'm dealing with cortisol level issues and insulin issues. But that's kind of the big overview picture of how I look at endocrinology from the clinician's perspective and actually what I teach. Because from my perspective, if you don't have a framework, then you're doing just, running random tests and chasing numbers around. And what I want to know is, okay, what's going on with sleep, hunger, mood, energy, cravings, exercise performance, exercise recovery, libido, erections, menses, all this stuff, which I would say is SHMEC, an extended version of sleep, hunger, mood, energy, and cravings. And then on top of that, I go, all right, here's how I look at the hormonal sort of system, running a chem panel CBC, and then working my way up from there.
I want to jump in real quick and tell you about one of my favorite new products. And to start out, I want to ask you a question. If you had to follow your friends around who are not the healthiest in the world and see what they are doing, what would be the number one thing you would probably tell them to do to start? For most people, that's going to be drinking more water, right? This is something that we talk about all the time in health and fitness. It's almost as if we think of it as an afterthought now because obviously water is so crucial. However, we oftentimes get this wrong. For example, did you know that when it comes to hydration, just drinking water can make things worse? Most people don't know this. Why? Partly because most people are over drinking water and under consuming the electrolytes that help water do its job. What we don't realize is that hydration is not just about water. It's about electrolytes, the minerals in there, as well as getting that water into the cells. And so you do not want to be over consuming water if you're not getting your electrolytes right. And this opens up a whole new discussion because most people are not getting their electrolytes right. For example, did you know that too low sodium is an issue? Just as much, if not more so, than high sodium. In other words, what we want if we're going to get the right electrolytes is to get the right amount of sodium and potassium and magnesium in the Goldilocks zone. We don't want too much. We don't want too little. We want it just right. This opens up a whole other thing here too, because people who are exercising, doing sauna therapies, doing low carb diets are disrupting and losing lots and lots of their electrolytes. For example, when insulin is not around in low carb diets, you will excrete lots of sodium. In other words, under that state, exercising, low carb diets, all these things, you actually need more sodium. And so if you're somebody who has been just drinking water, not paying attention to electrolytes, and also feeling fatigued, feeling like you're underperforming, not sleeping right, getting cramps, twitches, headaches, any of these things, then you are probably dealing with an electrolyte issue. This is where the product Element comes in. This product has been a game changer for me and many, many of my patients and clients. This is a rehydration electrolyte beverage, basically. It is a powder of electrolytes formulated with 1,000 milligrams of sodium, 200 milligrams of potassium, and 60 milligrams magnesium without the added sugar and other nonsense that comes in beverages like Gatorade. This stuff is basically a rehydration beverage on steroids. It is the thing that is going to replenish your electrolytes in the right ratios, decrease fatigue, really correct chronic dehydration. And by the way, many people are dehydrating themselves, becoming hyponatremic, low sodium, when they're consuming too much water. You need your electrolytes on board, especially if you are someone who is losing lots of sodium and other electrolytes through low carb diets and lots of exercise. This is where Element comes in. Element is a new sponsor to the Next Level Human podcast. I cannot recommend this product enough. I have been using this stuff for months now, and I have immediately seen changes in my energy levels. I feel like I'm operating on a whole other level, and I have seen this as being the primary thing that people who have been using Element have been telling me, that their fatigue is getting better, especially fatigue that comes after very intense workouts that involve lots of sweating and lots of intense output from the nervous system. Please check out Element. Use the code NEXTLEVEL. DrinkElement.com. That's DrinkElement.com. DrinkElement.com. And let's get back to the show.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I mean, I think as you just laid it out, like there's a lot that goes to it, and a lot of things that assess and that all intertwine with each other. Everything that we do is elective based, of course. So I think one of the early on hurdles we really try to press into is educating people on why they may need a more comprehensive panel or testing from the start. Yep. If they do come to us with specifically pretty obvious, low testosterone or different hormonal issues that we can kind of pinpoint. We do have some standardized panels just over time and just from clinics or from clients and patients that we kind of have packaged out there to kickstart their assessing what's going on, but then adding on as we go from there. And generally what we see is, generally about 6 to 8 weeks after we're treating somebody, whatever the initial eye-popping gap was, we're follow-up testing to see are we fixing what we put in there, and then taking a layer deeper. A lot of times looking at the metabolites of those hormones and testing those to see how is the body clearing those hormones after. How's the everyone's so individual. How's the patient doing? Their side effect profile, their symptomology, did it improve? And then also looking at the different markers in regards to cortisol and things of that nature. So generally, I would say it's been shifting more and more where we're getting a more full comprehensive look right from the start with patients when they begin to get them to understand that full picture, but definitely within that first 2 months of working with us. Because for some, I think it can be a lot to where they've done a lot of research. Maybe if it was a male and low testosterone, or female, maybe some peri or postmenopausal type symptoms, that there's a lot of information out there for them. So they kind of come in with that information. And so it's breaking down some of that, saying, yeah, we can help you with those things, but let's take a look at the full picture here and figure out a way to move forward. So,
and not only that, I think one of the things that I know you guys pay close attention to and clinicians need to do, once you get people on these, hormonal therapies, you have to look, for example, you got to run hematocrit on a male. You got to do some of these things just to make sure that, and most always you're going to see the men are just fine, but you need to rule those things out and pay attention to that stuff. So that's why it is incredibly nice to have individuals who actually look at this stuff and understand it rather than are missing things. That's another thing that I think we all could agree on. One of the things that's happening right now is there's many different avenues opening up where people are beginning to distrust, some conventional medicine and going towards one direction or the other, or working with people who don't have the background to understand some of the negative aspects of some of these treatments, and to be able to have a situation where you go, okay, yes, we're going to do this full panel. We're going to get you started, and then we're going to go and look and make sure that, your metabolism is responding to these appropriately, that you're not over aromatizing, that you're not having elevated hematocrit as a result of this, that you're not having other mood changes and things of that nature. One of the things we do know, of course, is that these are some of the, if not, I would argue, the safest medications on the planet. And part of the reason they are is because they're literally just our own hormones. And that's another thing I love about Evolve and the way you guys do things. It's, it is very, very safe for the vast majority of people. But of course, everyone's an individual. And as a clinician, you have to make sure that you're not doing damaged. And so looking after those other things. And then the other thing I would say there too, which is just a clinical pearl for people listening, from this. One of the things with any kind of bioidentical hormone replacement therapy, you oftentimes see this a lot. Most people think, oh, well, you get on testosterone replacement therapy, or you get on estrogen and progesterone, or you get on thyroid hormone, and you're immediately going to see weight loss. Oftentimes, it's just like the study we talked about in the beginning. That speeds metabolism, right, and that can speed hunger. And so one of the things that I've learned in my clinical practice is we have to do some of the things that we now know can blunt that stuff ahead of time. So one of the things I'm doing is making sure I'm getting at least lean body mass in grams of protein per day, up to body weight in grams of protein per day, to make sure that if I give this hormone replacement therapy and I educate the client on that, we're going to have to do something fiber-based, protein-based, perhaps. Mainly I choose fiber, protein, and water because those are the low-calorie, hunger-suppressing things to make sure we're not speeding up metabolism and then speeding up hunger, and educating the client about that. Right. Sure. This is going to make the metabolism a little bit more flexible. You'll get a little bit more recovery from your workouts, but we still can't just give you these things and have you keep living a crappy lifestyle. Sure. What we need to do is get you moving, get you hopefully lifting weights, get some protein on board. This is where we talk about this idea of like lifestyle plus hormone, and then you get amazing results. Putting hormones on top of a crappy lifestyle is going to be better than not having them, right? Like, if you're if you have a low testosterone man who's eating all the kinds of junk food and give him some testosterone, you're not going to necessarily see him lose weight, but you may see his metabolic markers get a little bit better. But ideally, we are doing some of the lifestyle things. And again, the reason I love Evolve, because you guys are all into that. It's kind of what you do. It's not, to me, just looking at, how you guys speak about this, you get that this is a lifestyle intervention that is done in the context of lifestyle changes. And that is where the power of these things, I think, is. I think a lot of clinicians and a lot of users get a little bit jaded from the perspective of, if I don't change my lifestyle and I take hormone replacement therapy, I don't necessarily see the body composition results that I would want, despite perhaps seeing the health benefits.
Sure. Yeah, I just want to, just for everybody out there too, kind of give a brief overview of labs and starting, and then what's out there in the industry, and then kind of tie it back to what you were saying is, general practitioners, from what I've been told from physicians, they may have a course or two on endocrinology or some of these topics. There's not a specific specialty, if you will, from in medical school, generally on some of these topics. There's outside fellowships and things of that nature. So most of the time, in what I've experienced and the feedback I've gotten out there is, your general practitioner may not be comfortable enough to move forward with some of these treatments, and they're going to tell you you're fine. And the range is pretty huge. And by the way, that range is based on a populace of people over a course of time. And so if you watch it over the last 50 years in men, the actual range itself, little side snippet people out there may not know, is that range has gotten smaller and smaller because the populace as a whole, as testosterone's gotten lower, which is a whole another topic. We can talk about what's happening with our food quality and things of that nature. But the second thing is, a lot of times too, if you don't have a severe enough symptomology, some of the markers we have on our panels are that you have in an elective type setting, your insurance is not going to cover, therefore your primary care may not write that up. So I think that takes it from, primary care. We certainly partner with those primary care folks out there. But then it goes to your testosterone mill, right? There are clinics out there that they just focus on testosterone, and it's in their name and it's in what they do. And I think, again, it's kind of a progression up from, not knowing what they're doing. But then it goes to the third phase, which I kind of just look at more that individualization as far as lifestyle management, and then checking, as far as dosages go of hormones, frequency of administration, lifestyle changes, as you mentioned. There's a lot of things that can affect that, to where I think if you're at a clinic where they're throwing a lot of pharmacology at you every time you have symptoms, you might want to put your hands up and say, whoa, let's talk about this. And I think that's really important for people to understand that. Even you mentioned a little bit about, estrogen elevating in a man. Well, estrogen does a lot of good things for our bone, our libido, brain and heart health and things. Starts to get a little too high. Maybe there's something going on there with estrogen methylation and how your body's actually metabolizing the estrogen we can work on, instead of throwing a bunch of other pharmacology at you there, right? To kind of improve that, which I know is you've had some guests on your podcast kind of discussing that as well. So I think it's important to look at that, as well as we've had a lot of patients come to us, and maybe we can unpack this a little further, but where the physician sees a slight elevation in hematocrit and they kind of freak out and they think that you got to go off testosterone away. And the guy's like, well, I'm feeling great. What do you mean? And some of the things I've heard out there from clinicians, I'd like to get your perspective on it is, if someone's hematocrit is in a normal range, it happens to go up a few points from testosterone. I think the argument out there is, first and foremost, why didn't this person have a cardiovascular event when they were 20 years old when their testosterone was at that level? So in other words, if you have low testosterone and the androgens induce elevation of hematocrit by supplementing it, right? So getting you back to where you were when you were 20, then generally your hematocrit is actually just going back to where it was 20, 30 years ago, just like your testosterone is. And so that's something that, I think is a lot of, again, I'm not a medical professional per se. This is just what I'm hearing. And it just kind of scratches my head. And I've talked to other clinicians out there and practitioners, and I'm like, am I seeing this right? Because it just seems like there's a quick jump in the scare. And it's like, well, maybe, again, we're not talking a hematocrit of 60 or something. We're talking a few points that it's elevated, and it's right away they have to stop treatment. But the guy's, the gentleman's feeling amazing from results from that. And so I'm wondering out there in just your research and what you look at, speaking specifically to some of the blood work, we know if you could talk a little bit about erythrocytosis, what you see there, some of those subsets, polycythemia and Versa, and how that, when it's kind of alarming in blood work, and just what does that range look like, or what have you seen it as far as what's.
Well, first of all, you rarely ever see it, right? You rarely ever see it. As a matter of fact, I can say I have not seen it in my clinical career at all. And also, to your point, you got to, from my perspective, when we look at these numbers, I think it's a mistake to focus on single numbers and single labs. What we need to look at is we got to go, okay, what's going on with this person? So let's take insulin resistance and let's say metabolic syndrome, for example. We're going to see a lot of the things already that we are scared of with, let's say, TRT, right? We're going to see some of those, some of the issues, for example. Some of the things that a lot of people will complain about with testosterone replacement therapy, get afraid of. Well, what's happening with the liver, right? What are we doing with the liver? The liver has to deal with these hormones. What's happening with some of the blood numbers, hematocrit being one of them? To me, if this is an individual where I see their blood sugars have gone down, which you see on TRT almost immediately, their triglycerides have moved down into the normal range, which you will see almost immediately with TRT. They have lost a couple inches in their waist, which again, you will see almost immediately with TRT, and especially if you are doing some of the lifestyle stuff, and then their hematocrit jumps up a little bit. I'm not concerned. I wouldn't be concerned about that at all. And I have seen those changes, but you have to look at it in the context. And by the way, blood pressure comes down, right? So everything that we would relate to metabolic syndrome, which in my model is an extremely rigid metabolism, begins to clear up with TRT. And then what you'll see is people will go off and say, well, what about this particular number? To me, and I think you're looking at it the exact same way I look at it. I go, I'm not going to chase numbers around unless those numbers are way out of range, right? And most of us, right, like this is the other thing that no one talked about in medicine. Most of us docs don't, even though we work with these things, we don't know, we look at the ranges as well. We don't all have these ranges memorized in our heads. But to me, I think the mistake that a lot of clinicians make and a lot of people who are commenting on this is to look, you always got to look at the holistic thing. If you see everything moving in the right direction in terms of what all the vitals and most of the blood labs moving in the right direction, then I don't think you need to be really concerned at all unless you see something go way out. For example, and here's an example that I do see a lot with TRT, actually, with men. Most of the time, men will come and want TRT because they're starting to see less responsive erections, right? This is the thing that scares them into, I better get. But I have seen TRT be, going higher in TRT, causing issues with erections in men who do not have it, because you alluded to it. Estrogen is very important in libido and erections, and it needs to be in the Goldilocks zone. Right. So what we should, and my whole point of bringing that up is that we need to look at symptoms first not just blood labs. And then you can go and look at the blood labs, right? So you say, oh, your erections got worse. Let's go and look. Oh, you're strongly aromatizing. Your estrogen went up. It must be too high. Then we adjust either through using natural compounds or Arimidex or something like that to control that. But we don't jump on board. In my mind, you don't go, oh, you aromatize like crazy. Your estrogen is high. And then the guy's like, I feel great. My erections have never been better. I'm not getting gynecomastia. I'm leaner. My blood sugars have gone down. My triglycerides have gone down. I'm not as concerned about that. Now, of course, you want to monitor it because you go, okay, well, maybe he's aromatizing. Maybe we'll see some issues there. But you can't divorce the labs from the patient. And we do that a lot. So to me, that's my take on it. And I think that's in line where sort of you are. It's really just measuring these things to make sure that this is not an individual metabolism that are doing things, because we are all unique. And the way we detoxify estrogen and testosterone and these things can be unique. And for some people, we need to make sure that we're not making things worse. And it almost never happens. And so it's really just one of these things like, we all took an oath, first do no harm. Mm-hmm. That's part of what you're doing. But the idea is by withholding a lot of these treatments, simply because you're afraid of one or two numbers going off on the labs, instead of looking at what's going on with the individual patient, that's also violating first do no harm. Sure. And so that's sort of my take on this. Yes, we should be following up. Yes, we should be looking at these numbers. They should not be scaring us, because to your point, if everything else is going in the right direction and you see hematocrit jump up a little bit, or you see estrogen rise a little bit, but everything in this man is better overall, then that's not something I'm going to do. I'm just going to make a note of it and say, okay, let's watch this. I'm not going to all of a sudden come off replacement therapy, especially when I've seen how much healthier they are. And I think this is the right approach. Too many people are chasing labs around rather than looking at the client sitting in front of them. So that's how I would address that.
I'm sorry to break into the show, but I wanted to take a second to cover one of our sponsors and tell you all about Paleo Valley at paleovalley.com. These are the grass-fed sticks that I tell you all so much about, that all of my friends know I have on hand constantly. They are in my car. They are at my house. I keep them at my sister's home and my parents' house. I have these things everywhere because they are the simplest, most convenient whole foods protein supplement you can get. Almost like carrying around pure protein, low carb protein in your pocket. They also, these Paleo Valley beef sticks are the only 100% grass-fed and grass-finished beef sticks on the market. They use organic spices. They are naturally fermented instead of using nitrates and nitrites that can be a problem in some of these cured meats. And they simply taste fantastic. Check out the original or the jalapeno. Those are my favorites. Please make sure you go over to paleovalley.com and visit. When checking out, use the code NEXTLEVEL for a 15% discount. Remember, our sponsors keep the show going by you giving them your patronage and spending your money on these high quality products. You actually do a few things. One, you're helping to support the podcast. And two, you are helping your health. And three, you are making sure that good quality companies like Paleo Valley can be out there doing their business, changing the world, making the earth better. One of the things you may not know about this is that grass-fed organic and grass-finished beef is doing something that is so utterly important for our environment, actually helping to repopulate the topsoil. A lot of people don't know this, but our topsoil is being extremely depleted. And raising animals, especially cattle, the correct way helps to get that topsoil back. This is one of the reasons why I love Paleo Valley. Not to mention it tastes fantastic, but they're one of these companies, like my other sponsors, Cured Nutrition and Organifi, that are doing the right things by the environment. I really appreciate everything they do, and I hope you will check them out. Thanks so much. paleovalley.com. Use the code NEXTLEVEL. And now back to the show.
No, I appreciate that. I think two things as you were talking that just pop out in my mind. The first is whenever you're starting any form of new exercise, nutrition program, therapies, pharmacology, nutraceuticals, there's always some form of a risk factor to starting it, right? There's something that may counteract a certain way in your body. But I also think I don't know if I want to give them the benefit of the doubt. I think a lot of people out there maybe are just not as well informed. I think people should be educated on the risk of not taking action as well. So there's very well documented studies on, well, if you don't do X, Y, and Z, if you go do this type of workout, or whatever the case is, you could injure yourself. But if you don't partake in these activities, like, these are the health consequences. The same goes with hormones, to where, yes, there may be some things that we have to massage and work through in your protocol. And that's why it's important someone's constantly assessing someone along the way. But also, hey, by the way, while you're concerned with those things, I want to make sure you're aware of these things over here, that this is also what the research tells us. And, the clinicians and people who work with people for 50 plus years now, this is well documented, that not take action, these are the other consequences that come with not taking action as well. And I think sometimes that's often overlooked.
100%. And there's a big misconception, especially among the public, right? Mm-hmm. There's this, I'm a naturopathic doctor. Okay. So if I have a bias, it does skew slightly to the natural medicine side of things. However, the natural medicine bias that is dominating in the, in the medical world right now, I'd say it's even in the medical world, and it's definitely in the lay public world, is a problem, especially when it is keeping, what I would say is the bioidentical hormones are about as natural as they get. When people are foregoing thyroid treatment, when they're foregoing testosterone treatment, estrogen and progesterone, these are some of the best anti-aging compounds we have, if not the best. Mm-hmm. And so part of what's happening too is this natural medicine bias is every bit as dangerous as the conventional medicine bias. Remember, we used to hate the idea that conventional medicine was just throwing pharmaceuticals at us. Well, we should be every bit as skeptical on the other side, that the natural medicine world is saying, oh, just take nettles and pygeum and this kind of stuff instead of taking Arimidex. That's not how we should be looking at it. We should be doing an evidence-based process, what works. And we have the data that tell us these are the best anti-aging health pharmaceuticals we can have. I don't even want to call them pharmaceuticals, because they are the natural hormone we would be replacing or making in our bodies in the first place. And so I do think that's part of the reason we get confused with some of these discussions. The natural medicine bias is getting in the way for a lot of people. And I do know people constantly, I don't want to take my thyroid meds. I'm just like, that is going to lead to issues way down the line, increased risk of dementia, increased risk of heart disease, increased risk of all kinds of things if you're not taking your thyroid medications. And I would say the same thing with testosterone replacement, estrogen, and progesterone. There are just so many benefits to these hormones that I think the skepticism in medicine right now is it's no longer warranted. The data is simply there to show us that these are powerful anti-aging, health-giving hormones. And yet there's still this huge sort of resistance to it, which kind of blows my mind. The only way I can wrap my head around that is just this anti-pharmaceutical natural medicine bias that people have. And it's unfortunate because it's starting to permeate into the professional ranks as well. And it might be surprising for people to hear me as a naturopathic doctor say this, but that's absolutely the case. And we always have to guard against bias and dogma in the way we do medicine. So to me, I go, the only bias you should have is a bias against bias, right? Sure. And we have to be very careful about that. So that's my thought on that. And I don't know if that's off topic for you or makes sense, but that's what it made me think of.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Actually, I think it brings up a good point. Maybe if you can talk through just in your expertise on how the difference between like synthetic hormones and bioidentical hormones. I think there's some misconceptions out there of how those work and pros and cons and things. If maybe you could walk us through that a little bit.
Yeah, well, first of all, the big thing is, right, it's like, people think if you're taking, primobolan or you're taking trenbolone or you're taking something like that, they equate this with testosterone therapy. These things are not testosterone therapy. They're not even they have some anabolic properties and androgenic properties that, of course, testosterone has anabolic and androgenic properties, but they're different compounds and they're not testosterone. So that's the first big mistake people make. They think anabolic steroids is testosterone. Mm-hmm. It is not. These are two different things. Testosterone has an amazing safety profile because our bodies are used to it. These other things, by the way, still have a pretty good safety profile, believe it or not, because they are analogs oftentimes of testosterone and things like that. But these are the ones that can be a little bit dangerous, especially, and this brings me to the other point, in the way a lot of people use these. It's when you're doing TRT, testosterone replacement therapy, you are restoring physiological range. And maybe we're pushing to the upper physiological range. And to Joe's point, right, that range is probably much higher than we think. It's probably, right now we think, 800 to 1,000 is where people should be. Well, there's an argument that could be made. It's closer to 1,200 to 1,600 based on Paleolithic individuals and things like that. So we don't necessarily know. But what I'm doing is pushing people up to 1,000, up near the higher range of physiological. And I'm mostly doing that not based on numbers, but based on how they feel. So again, these are not supra physiological ranges and doses we're giving. So that's the other thing. They're not anabolic steroids are not testosterone replacement therapy. 2, we are not doing super physiological doses of this stuff to get you up near 1,600 or 2,000 or that kind of thing. We are basically getting you restoring optimal levels to where when you were younger. And we're looking at that, of course, taking into context and saying, and this is the third and last point here, is it's also taking into context this individual and where they are in their life and what they are actually doing, and then how the testosterone is actually impacting them. And that is why the follow-up tests are important, not because we need to be terrified of hematocrit, simply because we want to understand how this hormone is currently interacting with the other side of the equation, which is the lifestyle. And then we make changes on both sides if necessary. But I think that kind of gets people to understand, which drives me nuts. They're like, oh, you're on, you're given anabolic steroids. That's very different. Now, most clinicians, I think, understand that. Most of the lay public does not. And those are very different things. So I don't know if I missed anything there that you'd want to, cover as well, but that's kind of how I think about that.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that's definitely something when we get our phone rings or people are reaching out, it's to kind of talk through the differences and what our goals are and what we're actually doing and what they can expect from it. We'd like to shift a little bit. And I know a lot of your, the content and is both male and female, but I know you also have some really good stuff in, women, female endocrinology and content and a lot of things that you've done to help women out there that are struggling with some of these issues. Can you walk through kind of maybe the same hormone cascade and just what you're seeing overall and some of the big hormones with women and what are some of the questions you're getting and how are you helping?
Well, I mean, one of the things that's really interesting, right, is you look at estrogen and progesterone. I like to think of them as non-identical twin sisters is the way I like to explain them. And twin sisters, because they're relying on each other. Obviously, they prime each other's receptors and they work in rhythm together. Non-identical because they do slightly different things. Now, both help control cortisol, but they're antagonists. So after ovulation, she's essentially making sure there's some extra triglycerides, some extra blood sugar around in case that egg gets fertilized, the way I like to say that. Now, the way I like to look at this is that most of the time in a young woman, it's going to be lifestyle oriented. We don't need hormone replacement therapy. Once a woman starts going into perimenopause, progesterone drops off first. And so almost progesterone alone therapy for perimenopausal women is fantastic and pretty much all that is needed. Once you get into menopause and postmenopause, that's to me when you start to bring the estrogen on board. And so that's the kind of the way I look at that. It's like younger women, certainly they can have some hormonal related issues that usually can be addressed through natural therapies, things like Vitex and things like that, natural changes in diet. Once you start getting into perimenopause and menopause, to me, there are other things you can do. Vitex does work very good in the perimenopausal period, but to me, that's when you're looking at progesterone alone, because what happens is progesterone drops and then estrogen starts being volatile and bouncing all over the place. So you put in progesterone, that calms, estrogen goes, oh, my sister is still here. I don't need to freak out. Right. Then when estrogen drops as well, that's to me where you begin to add in some of the estrogen therapies. Now, obviously that perimenopausal period lasts a very long time. And I have had women on progesterone. I like oral. progesterone therapies rather than, creams and things like that, oral progesterone therapy for a very long time, and they do incredibly well. Then when they start moving into menopause, based on symptoms, again, based on looking at the individual, you can either take them off the progesterone and they do just fine, or you transition into progesterone and estrogen. And so to me, it's a very interesting way of doing this. Now, one of the things that we see a lot is testosterone in women as well, which I also like and can be really useful for especially post-menopausal, when you start seeing those changes. And you're kind of getting a 2-for-1 there, right? Because you are getting some estrogen from that testosterone. And then and estrogen and testosterone are kind of doing very similar things in women. Estrogen is anabolic. It is insulin sensitizing. Testosterone is also anabolic and insulin sensitizing. And so oftentimes you'll see people in postmenopause go to testosterone replacement therapy, especially if you're dealing with people who don't tolerate estrogen well. And that's another option because you're kind of getting a 2-for-1 there. But that's kind of how I look at sort of the female cascade. Younger women, I'm not really doing anything other than adaptogens like Vitex to help get the system back, and lifestyle medicine. And then progesterone therapy by itself, and then adding in estrogen to the progesterone, and then possibly testosterone in lieu of those, or sometimes in addition to those, as the woman ages and gets into sort of the postmenopausal period.
Sure.
So that's the way I see that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I'll, if I remember, I'll come back to lifestyle and things that you're doing with younger women. But I did have one thing I wanted to make sure we capture is, perimenopausal. I think that's when a lot of women that at least I'm in discussion with and seeing is they think it's kind of more of a on-off switch. Like I'm, a healthy, vibrant, everything. And then all of a sudden, boom, menopausal, right? And so perimenopausal, like what are some common symptoms or things maybe women are experiencing that could kind of, turn on the aha moment to say, I should probably call someone or get checked or check my values or things of that nature. What are you seeing out there?
To me, it's a really important point, right? Because most of the time when people think, they oftentimes think sexual symptoms. Most of the time with men too, the first thing you're going to see is brain stuff. Men will start losing TRT. They'll start losing their drive. They'll start losing their focus, their ambition. Then I go, oh, something's going on here. Usually before they lose, sort of erections. Same with women. What you're going to start seeing is progesterone. Some of the progesterone metabolites influence GABA. GABA is the number one relaxing neurotransmitter in the brain. And so one of the first things you will begin to see is worry and anxiety that was not there before, and emotional volatility. Most women, by the way, get this right away. It's sort of like they get into, if they've ever had PMS, which not all women do, and PMDD, the mood related PMS, that's a lot of what perimenopause can feel like to a woman. And it starts to feel very volatile. And of course, estrogen controls dopamine and serotonin, which makes you relaxed and focused. And so sometimes because progesterone goes away and estrogen starts to jump all over the place, you can start feeling a little bit like volatile and almost like bipolar in a sense. 1 minute you feel focused and normal and good and high self-esteem, and the next minute you feel exactly the opposite: scatterbrain, worry, insecure, all of that kind of stuff. And so that's how you begin to know that a lot of times it's going to be a mood related stuff, and it may not be as pronounced as I'm describing it here. But I would say the first thing you begin to notice is that. Now, in terms of physiology in the body and not physiology in the brain, you start seeing an increase in waist circumference, despite the weight staying the same. And that's because the way I like to explain this is like, imagine Joan of Arc with her armor on and her shield. Well, estrogen is the armor, gives a little bit more protection, but progesterone is the shield. So they are the armor and the shield against female belly fat. Once progesterone goes away, you're losing a piece of your protection. And so now cortisol can exert a more pronounced impact on the midsection. And of course, when estrogen goes away, you really start to see this. But you can see that starting to happen in perimenopause as well. So what you end up having is this volatile, unstable, mood fluctuating a lot. You start to see some of the hot flashes that occur, not in all women, but estrogen in the hypothalamus, we believe, and progesterone might be playing a role as well. But this fluctuating estrogen can cause temperature changes as well. So you begin to see some hot flashes. You begin to see that temperature regulation and mood. And then you start to see increased fat deposition around the middle, regardless of what they're doing lifestyle wise. And this is when it really starts to be like, what is going on? Nothing has changed in my diet. And by the way, this will happen despite any increase in calories. Now, this is the part where we can see some of the primacy of hormones and body composition, because, there's no change in diet. Maybe they're not even responding with hunger and cravings. They've just become more insulin resistant as a result of loss of progesterone. So that becomes an issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that's a lot of those symptoms I think would even pop up earlier than, say, women have that kind of 20-day cycle that is constantly giving them feedback as far as how their hormone health is doing. So I think it's important to pay attention to that. But anything you would see later as far as or you've had reported or things of that nature as far as when progesterone starts to drop off, as far as how it affects that cycle and things of that nature.
Yeah, well, think about what ends up happening, right? So once the progesterone comes along after ovulation, the follicle becomes the corpus luteum, which then it becomes the source of progesterone. So if the woman is not ovulating, which at times she will and at times she will not in perimenopause, then sometimes she will feel normal and have normal progesterone, and sometimes she won't. But what I described previously, when that's happening enough, you're not necessarily going to see all the changes at once. So what I would say is, if you're seeing, let's say, some beginning mood issues, and you realize you didn't have a menstrual cycle and then you had one, and you're seeing on the times you have it, the mood sort of goes away, then you can kind of see, okay, this is what's happening. By the way, I have prolonged this in many of my patients using Vitex, which is why I love it. It kind of can, and I've even seen it bring menses back in women who are younger in menopause. So like, let's say early 40s and that kind of thing. And then getting on Vitex and the menses sort of coming back. But it's when all three begin to occur that there's a problem. And then later on, to kind of follow that through, that's when you usually start to see after perimenopause, once estrogen falls, this is where you start seeing vaginal atrophy. This is where you start seeing a lot of the libido lowering. Progesterone doesn't necessarily get involved there as much, but this is when you start seeing some of the sexual dysfunction as you progress through perimenopause. So there can be sort of this linear sort of way that you're kind of looking at and saying, oh, maybe it's beginning because the mood is starting. Next seems to be, oh, now all of a sudden I'm seeing some increase in body fat deposition around the middle. Oh, now I'm starting to see some of the sexual signs and things like that. Whereas I think most people just go, well, I'm fine because I'm not seeing any of the sexual issues yet, right? And that they don't realize that these things are impacting brain as much as they're impacting, the ovaries and all this kind of stuff. So hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. In anything in regards to, I've seen some information out there on during perimenopausal. I'm not sure if you can unpack it further, or if it's just when the adrenals starting to take over when progesterone goes down, and just kind of how it affects that. You were talking a little bit about the cortisol and some of the strains it puts on some of those other systems when that's going on. Anything there that you can unpack a little further from there? Or?
Well, I can clear up what I think is a common understanding, which I think we now know does not work this way. There's something called progesterone or pregnenolone steal that a lot of people in the functional medicine world still teach, which most of us who take endocrinology very seriously would say this is not actually what's happening. So the old thought in many and still is in many of the functional medicine circles is that as progesterone drops, that of course in the adrenal glands you produce progesterone as well, and its biochemical pathways going to cortisol. And it was believed that this could be essentially a primary source of progesterone in the blood that then the body could use in lieu of ovarian progesterone. So this we believe is probably not at all what is happening here. It is probably more a result of the idea that what progesterone is doing to antagonize cortisol effects. Mm-hmm. And then as progesterone drops, those cortisol effects become more pronounced. That is probably what is going on there. But it's still, right, whichever way that you look at this, this is the good news. Clinically, you still do the exact same thing. And the exact same thing is, at this point in time, you really have to make rest and recovery and these kinds of things priority for the women. This is where things like spa time, walks in the woods, massage, sex and physical affection, time with pets, creative pursuits, anything that begins to decrease that stress burden becomes a primary intervention. And this again shows the weakness of just the eat less, exercise more approach, because ultimately there's another aspect to this, and this is the mindfulness component, and the way we see and adapt to stress is a lot about what can we do to lower stress. And there are many, many lifestyle things that lower stress. By the way, if you eat too much or too little, you're going to have negative stress impact. If you exercise too much or too little, you're going to have negative stress impact. So to me, it's this Goldilocks idea. And when you reach this stage of life, it's basically saying, okay, yes, diet and exercise are both very important. However, I can't do too much or too little. So you got to regulate that. And then secondly, I have to move into this more mindset, mindfulness oriented lifestyle where an extra hour in bed may actually be a better treatment than an extra hour on the treadmill. And this is what a lot of women don't understand. And I think a lot of clinicians are confused about that as well.
Mm-hmm. No, it's a great point, and you articulate it well as far as how that it's a whole big cycle where things on the outside and the inside are affecting each other, and I think all the more reason to test, assess, and adjust as you're going through those things and having that well balance from there. So,
and to me, that what you just said right there to me is the end result of what we all should be doing. It's test, assess, adjust, right? I use the assess, investigate, modify, the AIM process. If we're doing good medicine, that is what we are doing. And when we are adjusting, we should not be just adjusting pharmaceuticals, and we certainly should not just be assessing labs. When we assess, we want to assess all the stuff: laboratory, SHMEC, sleep, hunger, mood, energy, and cravings, all that biofeedback, and vitals and blood labs. And then when we adjust, we also want to not just be adjusting pharmaceuticals. And I don't really put bioidentical hormone replacement therapy in that category. I see it as a natural treatment, but we also want to be doing that in with the lifestyle as well. So I think, again, it's a more holistic view. And I do think a lot of whichever direction clinicians are coming from now, whether they're more natural, functional medicine oriented, or whether they're more conventional oriented, I think we all could agree that the more holistic view is the more effective view clinically for the end user. And so that's kind of how I look at that. And it's very important. But yes, you do have to look at this and then adjust, and then look at it and then adjust, and make sure you're assessing the right things, not just laboratories.
Well, Dr. Jade, you're a wealth of knowledge. Appreciate you walking through everything with us today. I have a list that I could go on and on all afternoon, but I want to be respectful of your time as well. So we'll definitely have to do this again sometime soon. But I want to give a chance to get it. Just where can people find you, and just your website and things of that nature, where they can find more content about you as well.
I'm at Jade Teta, JADETETA on all the social medias. JadeTeta.com is my website. My podcast is Next Level Human, and absolutely love what you guys are doing, Joe. And so appreciate you as well. Thank you for my work, for your work, and thanks for having me on.
I appreciate it. Thanks for coming on.